My name is Robert Chen. For 14 years, I believed I had a real marriage, the kind built on loyalty, shared dreams, and quiet Sunday mornings. I was wrong. While I worked overtime, planned our future, and believed in us, Diana was playing a very different game. One built on secrets, resentment, and quiet contempt. The signs were always there. I just chose not to see them. And by the time I finally opened my eyes, the damage was already done. I'd built a successful career as a senior consultant at a financial advisory firm, earning enough to provide a comfortable lifestyle for both of us. Diana worked part-time as a real estate agent, though her income was inconsistent and seemed to matter less to her as my earning potential increased over the years. The subtle signs of entitlement had been there from early in our marriage, but I'd rationalized them as personality quirks rather than red flags. Diana had expensive tastes and little patience for budgeting discussions. She'd make significant purchases without consultation, then act surprised when I expressed concern about our financial planning. "Robert, you worry too much about money," she'd say when I questioned a $3,000 designer handbag or an impromptu spa weekend that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. "We can afford it, and life's too short to deprive ourselves." But we could afford it only because I was working 60-hour weeks and carefully managing our investments. Diana's contribution to our household finances was minimal, though her contribution to our household expenses was substantial. Over time, I began to notice that Diana's interest in our finances was selective. She showed no curiosity about our budget, our retirement planning, or our investment strategy. But she was extremely interested in the value of our assets, the equity in our home, and the potential returns on various financial opportunities. "Robert, have you considered investing in rental properties?" she'd ask during dinner. "Sarah's husband bought 3 condos last year, and she says they're making excellent returns." "Diana, real estate investment requires significant capital and ongoing management. We'd need to restructure our entire financial portfolio. But we have the money, don't we? Between your salary and our savings, we could easily afford to expand our investments." These conversations always made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. In retrospect, I realized that Diana viewed our marriage as a business partnership where she was entitled to equal decision-making authority over assets she hadn't contributed to building. The dynamic became more pronounced after my father's death 18 months ago. Dad had been a successful entrepreneur who'd built and sold several businesses over his lifetime. He'd also been a careful estate planner who understood the importance of protecting family wealth from potential future complications. When Dad passed, he left me an inheritance worth approximately $2.8 million, a combination of liquid investments, real estate, and business interests that he'd accumulated over 40 years of careful financial management. The inheritance was structured as a testamentary trust with specific provisions about distribution, management, and protection from claims by future creditors or divorcing spouses. Dad had been explicit about his intentions. The money was meant to provide long-term financial security for his bloodline, not to become community property in marriages that might not survive. "Son," he'd told me during one of our final conversations, "I've seen too many family fortunes dissipated by poor marriage choices. This inheritance is structured to protect your financial future regardless of what happens in your personal life." At the time, I thought Dad was being overly cautious. Diana and I had been married for 12 years, and while we had our differences, I believed our relationship was fundamentally solid. I was wrong. Diana's reaction to the inheritance was immediate and telling. Instead of grief for my father's passing or gratitude for the financial security his gift represented, her first response was excitement about our new investment opportunities. "Robert, this changes everything," she'd said the day after the funeral. "We can pay off the mortgage, buy rental properties, maybe even start that consulting business you've talked about." "Diana, the inheritance isn't ours. It's specifically structured as a trust in my name. Dad was very careful about the legal framework. But we're married. What's yours is mine, right?" The question made my stomach turn, though I couldn't explain why at the time. Now I understand that Diana was already viewing the inheritance as community property she could access and control. Over the following months, Diana's behavior became increasingly focused on gaining access to the inheritance funds. She'd bring up investment opportunities, suggest joint financial planning sessions, and occasionally make comments about consulting with estate lawyers to optimize our tax situation. "Robert, I've been doing research on trust structures," she announced one evening. "There are ways to modify these arrangements to provide better tax advantages and more flexible access to funds." Diana, Dad worked with estate planning attorneys for years to structure this trust. I'm not interested in modifying something that was designed to protect our family's long-term interests. But Robert, don't you think we should at least explore our options? Maybe there are opportunities we're not seeing. The opportunity I see is long-term financial security that's protected from risks Dad was wise enough to anticipate. Diana's frustration with my reluctance to treat the inheritance as joint property became increasingly obvious. She'd make pointed comments about my selfishness and my failure to view our marriage as a true partnership. "Robert, it feels like you don't trust me," she said during one particularly tense conversation. "We've been married for 13 years. Don't you think I've earned the right to be included in major financial decisions?" "Diana, you are included in our financial decisions. But this inheritance isn't a marital asset. It's a family trust that was specifically designed to remain separate. That's just legal technicalities. In a real marriage, spouses share everything." The phrase real marriage hung in the air like a threat. By the fall of last year, our relationship had deteriorated significantly. Diana had become increasingly critical, increasingly distant, and increasingly focused on what she saw as her exclusion from financial benefits that should rightfully be hers. She also began exhibiting behavior that seemed designed to create documentation of marital discord. She'd start arguments in front of friends, make comments about feeling financially controlled, and began what she described as a journey of self-discovery that involved expensive retreats, therapy sessions, and lifestyle changes that seemed calculated to establish independence. "I'm not happy, Robert," she announced in January. "I feel like I've lost myself in this marriage. I need time to figure out who I am and what I want." "What kind of time do you need?" "I'm going on a retreat. A month-long program focused on personal empowerment and life design. It's expensive, but I think it's worth the investment in my future." The retreat cost $15,000 and was described as a transformational experience for women seeking to reclaim their power and redesign their lives. In retrospect, it sounds like preparation for divorce rather than personal growth. Diana returned from the retreat in March with a new haircut, new clothes, new vocabulary, and what seemed like a completely new attitude toward our marriage. "Robert, I've gained so much clarity about what I want and deserve," she announced during our first conversation after her return. "I'm ready to make some major changes." "What kind of changes?" "I want us to restructure our relationship. I want equal access to all our assets, including the inheritance. I want to be treated as an equal partner in all financial decisions. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to accept being marginalized anymore." "Diana, you've never been marginalized. We make household financial decisions together. The inheritance is simply structured differently because it's a family trust." "That's not acceptable to me anymore, Robert. Either we're equal partners in everything, or we're not really partners at all." The ultimatum was clear, even if not explicitly stated. 2 weeks later, Diana moved into the guest bedroom. A week after that, she informed me that she'd consulted with a divorce attorney and was prepared to file papers unless I agreed to restructure the inheritance as community property. "Robert, I don't want to divorce you, but I also won't continue to be treated as less than an equal partner in this marriage." Diana, asking me to violate the specific terms of my father's trust isn't about equality. It's about control. It's about respect, Robert. And if you can't respect me enough to share what we've built together, then maybe we don't have a marriage worth saving. I realized that Diana had never viewed the inheritance as something my father had given to me. She saw it as something that had been given to our marriage, with her as an equal beneficiary. More importantly, I realized that her entire approach to our relationship had been transactional from the beginning. She'd invested 14 years in being married to me, and she expected a return on that investment that included access to any assets I'd acquired during our marriage, regardless of their source. That night, I made a phone call to my father's estate attorney. "David, I think I need to review the protective provisions Dad built into the trust. Diana's talking about divorce, and she seems to believe she's entitled to half of the inheritance." "Robert, your father anticipated this exact scenario. The trust was specifically structured to protect the assets from spousal claims. But you might want to consider some additional steps to document your compliance with the trust terms." "What kind of steps?" "Let's schedule a meeting. There are some proactive measures we can take to ensure the trust protections are fully enforceable." That meeting would turn out to be the most important conversation of my financial life. 3 weeks after my consultation with David Martinez, my father's estate attorney, Diana made good on her threat. I came home from work on a Thursday evening to find divorce papers taped to our front door and Diana nowhere to be found. A note on our kitchen counter explained that she was staying with her sister while allowing me time to process the reality of our situation. The divorce petition was 18 pages long and read like a declaration of war. Diana was seeking 50% of all marital assets, including what her attorney described as community property acquired during the marriage, regardless of nominal ownership or title structure. The inheritance was specifically mentioned as subject to equitable distribution under state community property laws. But what shocked me most was the narrative Diana's attorney had constructed about our marriage. According to the filing, I was portrayed as a controlling spouse who had systematically excluded the petitioner from financial decision-making and had used complex legal structures to hide marital assets from community property claims. The petition claimed that Diana had been an equal partner in building our family's financial success and was therefore entitled to equal distribution of all assets acquired during our marriage. It argued that the trust structure was a post-marital attempt to shield assets from equitable distribution and should be disregarded by the court. Most concerning was a section that detailed Diana's supposed contributions to our financial success. Her attorney claimed that her domestic labor, emotional support, and career sacrifices had enabled my professional advancement and therefore entitled her to share in all benefits derived from my career, including the inheritance that had come from my father's estate. The legal theory was creative, aggressive, and completely divorced from the reality of our marriage or the structure of the inheritance. I called David Martinez immediately. David, Diana's attorney is claiming the trust is invalid and that the inheritance should be treated as community property. Robert, I've seen this strategy before. Her attorney is hoping to pressure you into a settlement by claiming assets that were never subject to community property laws. Can they do that? They can try, but your father was very thorough in structuring the trust to prevent exactly this kind of challenge. What do I need to know? The trust was established before your marriage, funded with separate property, and contains specific provisions that maintain its separate character regardless of your marital status. Diana has no legal claim to those assets. Then why does her attorney seem so confident? Because many people don't understand the difference between confidence and competence. Her attorney is betting that you'll be intimidated into a settlement rather than fighting a claim that has no legal merit. What's our strategy? We're going to let them make their argument to the judge. Then we're going to present the documentation that shows why their argument is legally frivolous. Over the next 2 months, Diana's behavior suggested someone who believed she'd already won. She moved back into our house and began acting like she owned half of everything in it. She'd make comments about her share of various assets and seemed to take pleasure in my obvious stress about the divorce proceedings. Robert, I know this is difficult, but it'll be better for both of us in the long run, she said during one of our few direct conversations. Once we get the financial issues resolved, we can both move forward with our lives. What financial issues, Diana? You're claiming assets that were never marital property. That's for the court to decide, isn't it? Her confidence was unnerving. Diana had never shown much interest in legal details, but she spoke about the divorce proceedings like someone who'd been assured of victory. I began to suspect that her attorney had given her unrealistic expectations about the outcome, possibly to secure a larger retainer fee or to encourage her to reject reasonable settlement offers. The suspicion was confirmed when Diana's sister called me with what she described as a friendly warning. Robert, I think you should know that Diana's been telling everyone that she's going to take you for everything you're worth. She seems to think she's going to get millions from your dad's inheritance. Karen, the inheritance isn't marital property. Diana's attorney should have explained that to her. I don't think she's listening to explanations that contradict what she wants to hear. Robert, I love my sister, but she's got some unrealistic ideas about what she deserves from this divorce. What do you mean? She's been shopping for new cars, looking at expensive apartments, and talking about starting her own business with her settlement money. She's spending like she's already won a lottery. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. Diana and her attorney had constructed a fantasy about the inheritance that had no basis in legal reality. But their fantasy was about to encounter some very real legal facts. 2 weeks before our court date, I met with David Martinez for a final strategy session. Robert, I want to review what we'll be presenting to the judge. What do we have? David opened a thin folder and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. Everything we need. That's it? 2 pages? Your father spent 4 years working with estate planning specialists to create bulletproof documentation. The beauty of good legal work is its simplicity. David handed me the first page. This is a certified copy of the trust document, showing that it was established with your father's separate property 3 years before your marriage to Diana. He handed me the second page. This is Diana's signature on a postnuptial agreement from 2018, where she explicitly acknowledged that certain family assets would remain separate property and waived any claim to inheritance from your father's estate. I stared at the second document. When did Diana sign this? Do you remember when she was pressing you to invest in her friend's real estate project? The one that required a $200,000 investment? Yes, she was very persistent about that. You agreed to make the investment, but I recommended that we formalize some financial arrangements to protect both of your interests. Diana signed this agreement as part of that process. She acknowledged that she had no claim to the inheritance. She specifically waived any spousal rights to property inherited from your father in exchange for your agreement to invest in her business project. I realized that Diana had literally signed away her claim to the inheritance in exchange for access to a much smaller amount of money for an investment that had ultimately failed. David, does Diana's attorney know about this document? If they'd done proper due diligence, they would have found it. But based on their filing, I don't think they did much research into the actual legal structure of your assets. What happens when we present this in court? The judge will realize that Diana's entire case is based on claims she has no legal right to make. And then? Then Diana discovers the difference between confidence and competence. The night before our court hearing, Diana made one final attempt to negotiate. Robert, I'll be reasonable. I don't need half of everything. Give me a quarter of the inheritance and we can settle this without going to court. Diana, you're not entitled to any of the inheritance. It was never marital property. Robert, don't be naive. Courts favor equal distribution. I'm going to get half of everything tomorrow, but I'm offering to settle for less. We'll see what the judge thinks. Diana smiled with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. She was about to discover that she'd been playing an entirely different game than she thought. The morning of our court hearing, I woke up with the kind of calm that comes from thorough preparation. Diana, on the other hand, seemed nervous despite her confident talk the night before. Are you ready for this? She asked as we prepared to leave for the courthouse. I'm ready. Robert, last chance. We can still settle this reasonably. Diana, I've been trying to settle this reasonably for months. You're the one who insisted on taking claims to court that have no legal foundation. We'll see. Diana's attorney, Margaret Foster, was a family law specialist with a reputation for aggressive tactics and expensive fees. She'd obviously convinced Diana that her case was stronger than it actually was. David Martinez met me at the courthouse with his thin folder and the same calm confidence he'd shown throughout the divorce proceedings. Robert, remember that our job today is simple. We let them present their case. Then we show the judge the documentation that demonstrates why their case has no merit. How long do you think this will take? Probably less time than Diana expects. We entered the courtroom to find Diana and Margaret Foster already seated at their table, surrounded by stacks of documents, legal briefs, and what appeared to be financial analyses of our marital assets. Our table, by contrast, held only David's thin folder. Judge Patricia Williams called the court to session and asked both sides to present their opening statements. Margaret Foster stood up first and launched into a passionate argument about Diana's rights as a spouse and her entitlement to equitable distribution of all marital assets. Your Honor, Mrs. Chen has been an equal partner in this marriage for 14 years. She has supported her husband's career, managed their household, and contributed to the family's financial success in countless ways. The respondent's attempts to shield assets through complex trust structures represent a fundamental misunderstanding of community property law. Regardless of how assets are titled or structured, property acquired during marriage is subject to equitable distribution. Mrs. Chen is not seeking to take anything that doesn't rightfully belong to her. She is simply asking this court to recognize her legal rights as a spouse and to ensure that marital assets are distributed fairly. Margaret Foster spoke for 20 minutes, presenting a comprehensive argument about community property rights, equitable distribution principles, and Diana's specific contributions to our marriage. When she finished, Judge Williams turned to David Martinez. "Mr. Martinez, your response?" David stood up and walked calmly to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, I believe this case can be resolved very quickly. The petitioner's claims are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the legal structure of the assets in question." David handed Judge Williams the 2-page document from his folder. "If Your Honor would review these 2 items, I think the matter will become clear." Judge Williams took the documents and began reading. Her expression changed as she progressed through the first page, and by the time she reached the second page, she was shaking her head. "Mrs. Foster, have you reviewed these documents?" Margaret Foster looked confused. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what documents you're referring to." "The trust document establishing that the inheritance was separate property acquired before the marriage, and the post-nuptial agreement where your client waived any claim to inherited assets." The color drained from Margaret Foster's face. "Your Honor, we were not aware of any post-nuptial agreement." Judge Williams looked at Diana, who was staring at Margaret Foster with an expression of growing horror. "Mrs. Chen, do you remember signing this agreement?" Diana was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, but I didn't understand what it meant." Judge Williams read the document again, then looked up with what might have been amusement. "Mrs. Chen, this agreement explicitly states that you waive any claim to property inherited from your husband's father's estate. The language is quite clear. Your Honor, I signed that agreement because my husband wanted me to. I thought it was just a formality." "Mrs. Chen, this is a notarized legal document. The notary's notes indicate that the agreement was explained to you in detail before you signed it." Diana turned to look at Margaret Foster, who appeared to be realizing that her aggressive case had no legal foundation. Judge Williams continued reading, and I noticed the corners of her mouth turning upward slightly. "Mrs. Foster, your client signed away her rights to the exact assets she's now claiming in this divorce. Did you not research the legal structure of these assets before filing this petition?" "Your Honor, we focused on the community property aspects of the case. The community property aspects of assets that were never community property and that your client has legally waived any claim to." Judge Williams was no longer hiding her amusement. "Mrs. Foster, this is one of the clearest cases of frivolous litigation I've seen in years. Your client is claiming assets she has no legal right to claim, based on a theory of community property that doesn't apply to separate property held in trust." Diana was staring at the table, apparently realizing that her confident predictions about the outcome had been completely wrong. Judge Williams looked at Diana directly. "Mrs. Chen, you signed this agreement. You acknowledged that certain assets would remain separate property. You waived your rights to inherited property. And now you're asking this court to ignore your own legal commitments because you've changed your mind about what you want from your divorce. Your Honor, I made a mistake. You made a choice, Mrs. Chen, a choice that was properly documented and legally binding." Judge Williams turned back to Margaret Foster. "Mrs. Foster, I'm dismissing your client's claims to the inheritance assets. The trust structure is valid. The assets were never community property, and your client has waived any spousal rights to these funds. Your Honor, what about the other marital assets? The other assets will be subject to normal equitable distribution. But Mrs. Foster, I want to be clear about something." Judge Williams leaned forward. "Filing frivolous claims wastes the court's time and resources. Your client's attorney fees are not recoverable because you pursued claims that had no legal merit. I suggest you be more careful about your due diligence in future cases." The entire hearing had lasted less than an hour. Diana walked out of the courtroom in stunned silence, while Margaret Foster tried to explain how her research had overlooked the post-nuptial agreement that invalidated their entire legal strategy. As we left the courthouse, David Martinez smiled for the first time since I'd known him. "Robert, your father would have been proud. The legal structure he created worked exactly as intended. What happens now? Now Diana gets her share of the actual marital assets, the house equity, the joint savings, her car, but the inheritance remains exactly where your father intended it to be." "How much will Diana receive from the marital assets?" probably around $180,000 total, a far cry from the millions she was expecting. That evening, Diana sat in our kitchen, staring at the divorce documents with a dazed expression. "I can't believe I signed away millions of dollars," she said. "Diana, you didn't sign away millions of dollars. You waived rights to assets that were never yours to begin with. But if you hadn't signed that agreement, you still wouldn't have had any claim to the inheritance. It was established as separate property before we were married. Then why did you have me sign it?" "Because I wanted to protect both of us from exactly this kind of confusion. I wanted clear documentation that certain assets would remain separate." Diana was quiet for a long time. "Robert, I really thought I was going to get half of everything." "I know you did. Margaret Foster told me that community property laws would protect me." "Margaret Foster didn't do her homework. What am I supposed to do now?" "You're going to receive your share of our actual marital assets, and you're going to build a new life for yourself. But it's not enough to live the lifestyle I expected. Diana, the lifestyle you expected was based on assets that were never available to you. I feel like I wasted 14 years. You didn't waste anything, Diana. You made choices based on what you thought our marriage could provide, and now you're discovering what it actually provided." 2 weeks later, our divorce was finalized. Diana received $180,000 in assets and the furniture from our house. I kept the house, the inheritance, and the knowledge that my father's careful planning had protected our family's financial future exactly as he'd intended. Looking back on that day in court, I realized that the most striking aspect of the entire experience was how quickly confidence can transform into humiliation when it's not based on facts. Diana had walked into that courtroom with the swagger of someone who believed she'd already won. She'd spent months telling friends and family about the millions she was going to receive from my father's inheritance. She'd made plans for her post-divorce lifestyle based on money she thought she was entitled to claim. But the most revealing moment had come right before Judge Williams dismissed her claims. "Your Honor," Diana had said, making one final attempt to salvage her case, "I don't think it's fair that my husband can hide behind legal technicalities to avoid sharing what we built together." Judge Williams had looked at her with something approaching sympathy. "Mrs. Chen, these aren't legal technicalities. This is the law. Your husband's inheritance was never marital property. It was established as separate property before your marriage and maintained as separate property throughout your marriage." "But, Your Honor, I was married to him when he received the inheritance." "Mrs. Chen, that's not how inheritance law works. Property inherited by one spouse during marriage remains the separate property of that spouse, unless it's specifically commingled or converted to community property. But I helped support him while he was dealing with his father's death." "Mrs. Chen, emotional support during difficult times is part of marriage. It doesn't create property rights to assets that spouse never had claim to." Diana had looked around the courtroom desperately, as if she might find someone who would agree with her interpretation of property law. "Your Honor, this just doesn't seem right. Wives should share in their husband's good fortune." Judge Williams had leaned forward, and I could see her patience wearing thin. "Mrs. Chen, wives do share in marital assets, but they don't automatically acquire rights to property that was never marital property, especially when they've legally waived any claim to such property." "But I didn't understand what I was signing." "Mrs. Chen, you signed a notarized document after consulting with an attorney. You cannot now claim that you didn't understand the legal consequences of your own signature." That's when Judge Williams had begun to chuckle. Quietly at first, then with increasing amusement as the full scope of Diana's legal mistake became clear. "Mrs. Foster," she'd said to Diana's attorney, "your client signed away her rights to assets she's now claiming, assets that she never had rights to in the first place, based on a legal theory that doesn't apply to the facts of this case." Margaret Foster had tried one more desperate argument. "Your Honor, surely the court has discretion to consider the equity of the situation." "Mrs. Foster, the equity of the situation is that your client is receiving exactly what she's legally entitled to receive. Her share of actual marital assets and nothing more." Judge Williams had then turned back to Diana. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to understand something. Your husband's father spent years working with attorneys to structure an inheritance that would protect his family's wealth. You signed documents acknowledging that structure. Now you're asking this court to ignore both the legal protections and your own legal commitments because you've decided you want more money. Your Honor, I just think, Mrs. Chen, what you think about the fairness of property law is irrelevant. This court is bound by actual law, not by your personal opinions about what you deserve. The judge had then delivered what became the defining moment of the entire proceeding. Mrs. Chen, you tried to claim assets you had no right to claim, based on legal theories that don't apply to your situation, while ignoring documents you'd signed that waived the very rights you were asserting. Judge Williams had shaken her head with obvious amusement. In 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case where the petitioner's legal position was so thoroughly undermined by their own actions. Diana had started crying at that point, but Judge Williams had continued. Mrs. Chen, your tears don't change the law. Your regret about signing away rights doesn't invalidate your signature. Your disappointment about receiving less money than you expected doesn't create legal claims you never had. The judge had then turned to Margaret Foster with obvious disapproval. Mrs. Foster, I expect attorneys to research the legal basis for their claims before filing petitions in my court. Your failure to discover the post-nuptial agreement and your misunderstanding of inheritance law have wasted everyone's time. Your Honor, Mrs. Foster, there is no excuse for filing claims this frivolous. Your client's demands were legally impossible from the beginning, and proper research would have revealed that immediately. As we'd left the courtroom, I'd heard Diana asking Margaret Foster how she could have made such a fundamental mistake. You told me I was entitled to half of everything, Diana had said. I thought you were, Margaret Foster had replied weakly. I didn't realize about the post-nuptial agreement or the trust structure. But you're supposed to be an expert in family law. Diana, these kinds of estate planning structures are complex. Complex? You told me this was going to be straightforward. I'd realized that Margaret Foster had taken Diana's case without doing basic research into the legal structure of the assets Diana was claiming. She'd assumed that standard community property rules would apply without investigating whether the specific assets in question were actually subject to those rules. It was legal malpractice disguised as aggressive advocacy. But more than Margaret Foster's incompetence, what struck me was Diana's complete inability to understand why she wasn't entitled to assets she'd never had claim to. Even after the judge's explanation, even after seeing the documents she'd signed, even after learning that the inheritance had been separate property from the beginning, Diana still seemed to believe that she was being cheated out of something that should rightfully be hers. Robert, she'd said as we walked to the parking garage, this isn't over. I'm going to appeal this decision. Diana, you can't appeal a judge's correct application of the law. I can appeal her interpretation of what's fair. Diana, courts don't decide what's fair based on your personal preferences. They decide what's legal based on actual law. Well, the law is wrong then. That statement encapsulated everything I'd learned about Diana's character during our divorce proceedings. When reality didn't match her expectations, she blamed reality rather than adjusting her expectations. She'd expected to receive millions of dollars from an inheritance that had never been available to her, based on legal theories that didn't apply to our situation, while ignoring documents she'd signed that explicitly waived any claims she might theoretically have had. When her fantasy collided with legal facts, she'd decided the facts were wrong. The weeks after our hearing revealed why Diana was so confident and why her lawyer, Margaret Foster, failed her. Foster, desperate for fees after losing clients, promised Diana millions without researching the inheritance structure. She filed motions under laws that didn't apply, ignoring a post-nuptial agreement that destroyed her case. Margaret told me she's never seen trusts like your father used, Diana admitted. That's because she didn't research before filing, I said. So, was she incompetent? Diana, she filed on laws that didn't apply and missed a post-nup. What do you think? Diana ended up paying nearly $25,000 in legal fees from her $180,000 settlement. But the real cost was realizing marriage hadn't entitled her to my father's estate. She confused marital assets with everything we touched. Friends who'd heard her brag about millions now knew the truth, and she admitted, I told everyone I'd be set for life. Now I'm embarrassed. You are secure, Diana. You just believed money that was never yours would be. Months later, she called. Robert, I was wrong. I see now inheritance planning protects family wealth. Your father wasn't cutting me out. She asked if $180,000 was enough. Plenty if you build a life on what you have, not what you imagined. She eventually started a small business and found stability. My father's trust remained untouched, his foresight shielding our legacy. Later, I found a letter he'd written. Marriage changes, people change. Protecting inheritance isn't distrust, it's preservation. Documents ensure money goes where it's intended, not where people hope. Diana had wanted millions. All it took to defeat her claim was 2 pages and the truth.